Hello, this is Supply and Demand, Section C, Elasticity and Surpluses versus Shortages lecture. Our prioritized standard is Economic Standard 21. Objectively, we're going to distinguish between factors that result in elastic or inelastic demand and elastic or inelastic supply. While you will see increases in quantity with either an increase of demand or supply, and a decrease in quantity with either a decrease of demand or supply, how large these changes in quantity will be is dependent on an item's price elasticity. Now, price elasticity is the degree to which changes in a good or service's price affects the quantity demanded by consumers or the quantity supplied by producers. Items with elastic demand, notice, will look a little bit more like this, more horizontal, or supply, so things with an elastic supply are going to look more like this. Price changes have a significant impact on the quantity. So depending on what price they're charging for an item, either maybe very few people might be interested in purchasing the item, or a lot of people might be interested in purchasing the item. Or if we're talking about supply, for low prices, very few might produce, but raising the price might result in a massive increase in the amount that is supplied. Items with inelastic demand are going to look more vertical, or supply, so inelastic supply is going to look more like this, again, more vertical. Price changes have very little impact on the quantity. So for instance, at high prices, there's not going to be much difference between very low prices for consumers. Or producers, very high prices aren't going to result in much difference than very low prices. All right, so elasticity is very much like the matrix. You can't be told what it is. You have to see it for yourself. All right, so let's say that we'll make a little dotted line, and that dotted line will represent the price of that product. And then at that price, here is a quantity, here is another quantity. So if we lower that price, now I'm going to try to have a lowering that's going to be roughly the same. So this change in price results in this big difference in the amount that people want. They drop the price, more people want this item, as you would expect. With an elastic demand. With an inelastic demand, you lower the price, more people want the product, but it's basically just this really small amount. So elastic demand is going to result in a large difference depending on a price change, as where inelastic will have a much smaller one for a price change. And to look at supply of elastic compared to inelastic supply. So let's say that we start with, we'll just say this little dotted line we're making here represents what the original price point was for this item. So at this original price point, we have two different just generic quantities for what that was. All right, let's say we raise the price. By raising the price, try to make it roughly the same percent change. So basically at this point, we've raised the price, and now this much more of the item is actually being produced now. When we do it on inelastic supply, there is going to be a difference, but it's going to be a really small difference. So again, we're talking about supply, elastic supply. Price differences have huge impacts. Inelastic supply, price differences has very small impacts. The price elasticity of demand is influenced by the availability of substitute goods or services, if the item is regarded as a necessity or a luxury, and if the cost of the product represents a small or a large portion of a consumer's income. So elasticity of demand, elasticity of supply. Generally speaking, things are usually more elastic in the long run. But in the short run, they can be influenced by a few factors. So things that have elastic demand. So in a sense, things that operate more like this few things you're going to notice. First, item has many substitutes. So if you're talking about an item that if the price of one gets too high, you could just go buy another, then generally speaking, people just go buy another. They're not going to kill themselves buying an item that's too expensive when they could just find another one that's probably cheaper. Also, things that are considered a luxury. So things that you don't have to have, generally speaking, if the price of those things are too high, you just will not purchase those. If the price gets lower, hey, you might go buy them, but you're not going to just purchase those just blindly. And also, products cost represents a large portion of consumers' income. So something like a house, a car, those are very expensive things. So generally speaking, if their prices are higher, people are usually going to be less willing to purchase that item. If the prices go down, they're going to be much more willing to purchase those items. So again, those things behave this way and are considered more elastic with demand. Inelastic demand, so that's going to be things that operate more like this. A few things we're going to notice there. Item has few substitutes. So if you don't have other options, if the price of it goes up or down, but you have no other options, generally speaking, you're probably going to purchase about the same amount every time because there's no alternatives. Also, things considered a necessity. If something is something that you must have, generally speaking, you don't even think about it when you need to buy the item. You don't think about price, you just buy the item because you just have to have it. And also, products cost represents a small portion of consumers' income. So if a price of an item is generally very low to the point where you don't even know how much it costs because it's just so low, generally speaking, you'll buy pretty much the exact same amount of that item regardless of the price because it's not going to break the bank, so you're probably not going to pay much attention to it. The price elasticity of supply is influenced by the time that's necessary to produce the item, the expense of the product the expense to produce the product, and the availability of resources necessary to produce the item. So things that behave more like this, that are more elastic. Well, products can be made quickly. So if we're talking about like paper clips, you can crank those suckers out. That's not very hard at all. So if price goes up, it's going to be very easy to increase the production. Also, inexpensive to produce. Things like, again, paper clips are really easy to make. They don't cost you hardly anything at all. You're just getting like a little sliver of steel. It's not going to be very expensive at all to produce. So if the price went up, it will be very easy to increase the production of that item. And also using many readily available resources for production. So if what it takes to make an item is readily available, it's going to be very easy to just crank out more product if the price of that product starts to increase. All right, things that behave more like inelastic supply. Well, a few things you're going to notice here. Production requires a great deal of time. So if it takes you a long time to produce something, then generally speaking, it doesn't really matter what price people want to pay for it. You're not going to be able to increase your production dramatically because of that. Also, expensive to produce. If the product that you are in fact making is a very expensive one to make, just because the price of it goes up does not translate to it's going to be that easy to actually increase your production of the product. And also, using a few resources that are not readily available for production. So if the resources it takes to produce whatever item it is, let's say a nuclear bomb, well, those resources aren't just laying around, so it's very difficult to actually go out and produce that product. So therefore, you're not going to notice a dramatic difference in that. Now, price elasticity can actually be calculated using this equation. You take your percent change in your quantity divided by your percent change in price. If your answer is equal to 0, that's considered to be perfectly inelastic, meaning the quantity does not change at all. If your answer is something less than 1, it's considered to be inelastic. If your answer is exactly 1, it's considered unitary elastic. That's basically what the generic supply and demand curves I normally make are, unitary elastic. If your answer is greater than 1, that's considered to be elastic. And if your result gives you infinity, then that's perfectly elastic. So something considered perfectly inelastic has a quantity that cannot be altered at all. Something considered unitary elastic is neither elastic nor inelastic. So essentially the rise and the run are going to be equal on the slope. Things that are perfectly elastic are basically only theoretical, meaning they're not actually possible in reality. So when talking about demand, any increase in price would actually cause no one to want an item. And any decrease in price would actually cause every single person to want an item. So, I mean, that doesn't make sense. That would never actually happen. So that's why this last one is only theoretical and doesn't actually take place. While markets function the most efficiently when items are sold at the equilibrium price level, this does not happen immediately, and markets will experience either surpluses or shortages prior to arriving at a point of equilibrium. So equilibrium is a long-term thing. It is not a short-term thing. So a surplus is when the quantity that is supplied exceeds the quantity that is demanded at a particular price level. So like if you're charging at this price, here is our quantity that is supplied. So supplied, Q. This is our quantity that is demanded, because that's the demand curve. So this basically means that more of an item is actually being supplied than consumers interested in purchasing it. So therefore, our quantity supplied is greater than our quantity that is demanded. There is a little thing you can look for that lets you know that, hey, this is a surplus. Well, we have this little triangle area here that is formed by the price being at a level higher than equilibrium. So whenever you see this, that means you're dealing with a surplus. Prices that are too high cause a surplus, and surpluses can actually occur due to a decrease of demand or an increase of supply, meaning maybe at one point this price was an equilibrium point, but possibly the demand, like let's say this used to be the demand, but oh look, it shifts to the left and now it's decreased, so that's not actually what it is anymore. Or possibly maybe this used to be the supply, and maybe at some point it shifted to the right, so therefore that's no longer the equilibrium price. Now, surpluses can be eliminated by lowering prices. Now, a shortage is when the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied at a particular price level. So that essentially means less of the item is being supplied than consumers that are interested in actually purchasing this item. So essentially the quantity that is demanded, which here's the demand curve, that's the quantity at that particular price, exceeds the quantity that is supplied. So again, here is the supply curve, that's the price, and that supply, so therefore the quantity supplied. If you're looking for a little visual cue to let you know you're talking about a shortage, well, we're looking for a triangle again, and this time it's going to look like this. So whenever you see that, that means you're dealing with a shortage. So prices that are too low cause a shortage. Shortages can occur due to an increase of demand or a decrease of supply, meaning at one point in time, this might have represented an equilibrium point, but things actually changed that actually caused that to change. So possibly maybe at one point this used to be the demand curve, and then therefore it shifted to the right, and therefore now that's not the equilibrium point anymore. Or maybe this point maybe used to be the supply, but then it shifted to the left, and therefore that changed the equilibrium point also. Shortages can be eliminated by raising prices. All right, this concludes supply and demand, section C, elasticity and surpluses versus shortages lecture. Our prioritized standard again was economic standard 21, and objectively now you can distinguish between factors that result in elastic or inelastic demand and elastic or inelastic supply.